because we are the most terrifying creature that exists out there.
Yeah.
And this human fear of other humans actually is a big kind of force in storytelling and folklore, because if you look at some of the biggest ones, like the mermaids, like centaurs, like all of these creatures, the ones that kind of have this longevity, even the minotaur, they're all part human.
Yeah,
there's all an element of them that is human, and that is the thing, is that, and like with skinwalkers, because of the kind of the Native American kind of mythology around the idea of capitalism, and that's how kind of these entities were created. It's all down to the idea of what are the worst elements of humanity.
Hello, welcome back to the Bethnal Archives podcast. We're here at the Colchester Castle Jail with curator Ben Paites. Welcome.
Hello, lovely to be here.
Thank you very much. Just as a heads up, this podcast is meant for entertainment purposes. Please do your due diligence. Some of the stuff we're talking about is the paranormal, and so it does go into pseudoscience. So make sure you take everything with a pinch of salt and do your own research. So first of all, tell us how you got into history, archaeology. Like how did you come here, and what has been your experience?
Yeah, so actually I grew up kind of the other end of Essex, and I went to Colchester Castle quite a few times when I was younger, but I'd always had an interest in history. My main area of interest is the Romans, and I think partly that was because I also have always had an interest in language, and I started kind of trying to learn Latin when I was a lot younger, and went on to actually study it, get A-level in Latin as well, taught Latin for a very little while. But at the end of the day, I always knew that museums were the place that I loved, partly because of learning about history, but it's also kind of about kind of remembering what's come before and remembering the people that have been before. And a lot of the stories that I particularly resonate with and I love telling to other people are the stories of individuals who have kind of lived, whether it's in the castle itself or lived in Colchester, who have made a huge impact on our history, whether it's local, whether it's national, whatever the scale. I just love telling stories of people and what they did in the past. So yeah, my background is archaeology specifically. So I studied archaeology at university, and still my main passion was the objects. I didn't really like being in the dirt for too long. I loved dealing with the objects afterwards. Cool. So that kind of reinforced the idea for me that actually probably being with those objects in a museum was the best place for me, so that I could then tell those stories to other people.
Amazing. And so for this episode particularly as well, we're talking about the Colchester's the castle's new exhibition, which is all about like mythical beasts,
mythical creatures. Mythical creatures. It's looking at kind of the history of mythical creatures, why we believe in them, why they were created in a sense. We've got some incredible objects that will be there, some of them representing kind of images of mythical creatures throughout history, but also some of them are kind of natural science specimens or fossils and things that people in the past likely discovered, and that's what led to them believing mythical creatures were real.
Amazing. Okay, so let's just jump in. So you love the Romans.
Yes.
Let's go before the Romans.
Okay.
So
yep.
Pre-Roman. What we had dinosaurs.
Yes, we did. A little while back.
A little while back, there were dinosaurs around. Tell us a little bit about, what we understand of mythical creatures and beasts and stuff like that, but pre-Roman.
So pre-Roman, this is where we start to look at prehistory. So prehistory is basically anything that's not written.
Okay.
So the Romans is when we start to have the accounts, in Britain at least, when we start to have written accounts of whether that's people's encounters with strange creatures, whether that's stories that involve mythical creatures. So anything that happened before then, we don't really know a lot about. So we kind of refer to the period just before the Romans arrive as the Iron Age.
Right.
The Romans wrote about the Iron Age people.
Okay.
And they wrote about some of their practices and things that they did. But again, it's Romans writing about these cultures that they're not very familiar with. So the Druids, a lot of people know about the Druids, and Druids had their own belief systems and their own practices and things. And a lot of that has gone into modern day kind of belief and practice amongst modern day Druids and pagans and things like that. And so some of those stories have drawn kind of throughout that long history from prehistory into the modern day. But we imagine over that more than 2,000 years, some of those stories have changed.
Yeah.
But in terms of prehistory, one thing we can talk a little bit about is how, as I sort of touched upon with the Mythical Creatures exhibition, it's how discoveries have led to this belief.
Right.
How fossils, say, lead to the belief that there were giant creatures living in the world at some point that no longer exist, and they must have been creatures walking amongst humans. So one of the things we touch upon is, it's really interesting, you find cases of mammoth bone. Mammoth is found across kind of almost the world pretty much, and you find them in Britain, you find them near to here in Colchester, in Clacton. We have quite a big mammoth collection of fossils in our collection in Colchester, and a lot of them come from Clacton. They were dredged from the waters. But in some parts of the world you find them exposed. So in North Africa, in a lot of the desert of North Africa, you find exposed mammoth bone, and it's really interesting. Someone did a study in looking at these stories of giants and the locations of mammoth bone and where they're found, and they correlate.
Yeah.
So the idea is that probably people wandering through the desert would have seen these giant bones. They didn't know what they belonged to, so they must have assumed they were giant humans.
Yeah.
And that's where that kind of mythology comes from.
But that's interesting you say that as well, because we know from like anthropology and stuff like that that there was a time when there was, what was it, several different species of humanoids.
Yes, going back far back, the humans that lived alongside Homo sapiens were different enough that you would have noticed, like a Neanderthal, for example. You look at a Neanderthal skull, they would have been quite significantly different in appearance to a modern human. Sure, they're taller, they're stockier, but they would have looked quite different. There's actually a lot of people think the concept of Uncanny Valley might come from the fact that we once lived alongside other humans. I don't know if you know a lot about Uncanny Valley. So yeah, whenever we see anything that looks human but isn't quite, it gives us this kind of sense of dread and fear. Like robots, that's the big thing. And then kind of AI and all of that, like that's one of the big discussions around kind of this primal fear we have of anything that looks human but isn't quite human,
because they may have been other tribes or species that may have attacked us.
Exactly. Like at one point we were living with Neanderthal and potentially other humans, Denisovans and others, that were living in especially Europe at the same time as Homo sapiens, and we could have encountered them. In fact, by genetic studies, we know that Neanderthal we most certainly encountered. So it's interesting. You kind of, although we don't have writing to tell us stories about some of these things, there is definitely a sense of kind of folklore and mythology passing down through genetics, which is fascinating.
Wow, that's really cool. We'll jump forward to your favourite period.
Yeah, sure.
The Romans.
Yeah.
Tell us what sort of giant beasts existed then, maybe that are currently extinct now, that may have influenced certain folklore trends or stuff that you know about.
So there's not a huge amount that existed in the Roman times that doesn't exist now. They did force some creatures into extinction. But not huge numbers, and nothing really giant that would have perhaps been seen as a mythical creature or a monster back then that we would understand now as different species. Within the mythology of the Roman world, there's definitely extinct species at that time, not just the giants that we talked about, but extinct species at that time that were kind of adapted into myths and legends.
Okay.
So kind of we start off with the idea of the Cyclops.
Yep. All right.
So Cyclops is quite common in Greek and Roman mythology.
Yeah.
And if you look at early depictions of Cyclops on kind of Greek vases and things, they have tusks. They have little kind of teethy things and big central eye. Now, if you were to look at the skull of a pygmy mammoth, which were very abundant on the islands of Greece quite a few thousand years ago, didn't exist when kind of humans were there, they look exactly like what a Cyclops would look like. They have a huge hole in the center of their face, which could have been where an eye was. It wasn't. They were like elephants today. But they also had these tiny little tusks, and it's exactly how the Cyclops depictions are seen. And we think that that's probably where that Cyclops myth comes from, because they kind of originate in Greece and then they spread to the rest of Europe. That's probably where those stories come from. Similarly, the stories of the Griffin. So the Griffin is one of our key creatures in the Mythical Creatures exhibition. And the stories of the Griffin really come from kind of the Middle East and kind of heading towards Eastern Asia. Now in Eastern Asia and kind of areas around there, we find Protoceratops skulls and other kind of species like Protoceratops, which were dinosaurs. And they look like they have big beaks, they have these kind of frills on the back of their head, but they walked on all fours. So it's a bit like a lion's body in the fact they're all on all fours, but they had these beaks, which is exactly what a griffin kind of depiction is, without the wings maybe. But you know, if you see a creature with a beak, you might assume, well, they would have had wings, but they haven't survived. So we'll add the wings on, and then you've got this creature that exists in mythology. So a lot of it is to do with them finding creatures, not fossils or bones, not really understanding what they are, and so creating these stories around them.
Yeah. So a lot of ancient myths and legends are kind of almost based off of very crude archaeology.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so they would have been
paleontology.
Yeah, paleontology for the dinosaurs. So they were looking, and one of the key figures we have from the Roman world is Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder wrote a lot. He wrote a book called The Natural History, which kind of looks at huge array of different subjects, one of which is the natural world of animals and creatures. And he writes kind of lions, kind of foxes, any of the animals that you would see in your day-to-day life.
Tigers and bears.
Exactly, oh my. Alongside things like the blemii, manticores, unicorns, like all those creatures are side by side in his text as if they are real beings. Because for Pliny, he was perhaps not the best scientist in the sense that most of his writing comes from what he'd heard from other people.
Okay.
So he didn't go and observe himself. He is listening to stories, he's finding about what other people have witnessed and creating his own kind of understanding of what that creature might have been, which we consider to be mythical creatures. Now, some of those stories might be based on reality though. So the unicorn, which is another big creature in our exhibition, is a key example of that. In that for some stories we think in the early days, the discoveries or kind of the observations of rhinoceros in the wild might have been these kind of big creatures with long things sticking out their head on all fours. That story then kind of travels to other parts of the world where it kind of gets adapted. They become more slender. It's a bit like a horse because it's on all fours. It's still got the big horn, and then eventually you have the unicorn.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of the way in which storytelling both kind of transmits this narrative of what is believed to exist in the world, but also embellishes and creates this kind of fantasy of what isn't actually there.
Yeah. And with manticores as well, like where do you think that might have originated?
Now, I'm not really sure. Manticores are absolutely kind of wild in terms of the descriptions and things. I think there have been suggestions of some creatures that they might have been. I can't really remember what they are, but again, at the end of the day as well, some of it might be pure fantasy. Like we know today people have imaginations, they create things in their heads and they write them down. It doesn't mean that it was necessarily true. But if you've heard that story, you might think it's true. So you might think that actually this was something that exists, and if you've never been to that place, who are you to deny that creature existed somewhere?
Yeah, indeed. We spoke a bit about crocodiles.
Yes.
Tell us about crocodiles.
So crocodiles, we're skipping forward a little bit with crocodiles. So crocodiles of course are not native to Britain. So until recently, when we have things like zoos, most people wouldn't have ever encountered a crocodile. Even certain types of snake in Britain, the largest snake is not huge. I'm sure you would probably scream and jump in the air if you saw one in the wild, but they're not, compared to snakes in general, they're not massive. But what we see happen in the kind of medieval period, a bit later in the medieval period, is wealthy people start importing exotic creatures to Britain, and particularly royalty. So Tower of London famously had a menagerie, and the menagerie had kind of creatures from all over the world, one of which was crocodiles. And at the same time, especially in Essex, where we are, in the medieval period, later medieval period, we have a lot of stories of dragons. There is a huge wealth of stories of dragons. And what we're starting to wonder now, and we know of some accounts where this did happen, is what would happen if a crocodile or a python or something like that were to escape from captivity in, whether it's the Tower of London or somewhere else. We know a crocodile did not escape, but was apparently flushed out in a storm once, but managed to get out, and then ended up in a village in Essex in the 1400s.
Wow.
What would those people believe that thing was? They wouldn't think, oh, that's a crocodile. or even they wouldn't think that's a big snake necessarily. They would think, I've heard stories of these giant lizard-like creatures that breathe fire. Perhaps it's a dragon.
Right.
And so some of the stories that we have in Essex, one in particular, Wormingford, if you go to the church, there's quite a lot of churches actually associated with these legends. But if you go to the church, they have a stained glass that was kind of made to commemorate this famous encounter with a dragon that happened nearby. And actually, they've used a crocodile.
Okay. Oh, right.
Rather than a dragon image, they've used a crocodile, because there is now this belief that crocodiles may have been the inspiration for a lot of these legends in Britain and possibly elsewhere. That it's almost become, for those that kind of study it and kind of are interested in the kind of the science of folklore and mythology, it's almost become kind of fact that this is probably what was happening a lot of the time.
Well,
and so yeah, the crocodile is kind of this interesting kind of symbol now of kind of what dragons kind of may have actually been.
wow. So St. George was actually fighting a big old crocodile.
It could well be. I mean, St. George comes from Turkey originally, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So like, that is the part of the world where you might have crocodiles aren't as far away from them as in Britain.
Yeah.
So yeah, it could quite possibly. And then again, those stories travel. George fought a giant lizard-like creature that emerged from the waters and was kind of like spouting, not fire, but and then perhaps that then translated into a dragon that we know of today.
Great. Well, that's really cool. Okay. What we've got here, we're going to go back to the Romans.
Yep, sure.
We're going to go back again. Now I've got the crocodile out of the way. So do you think the Roman obsession with beasts and mythical creatures and in the arenas that they would get gladiators to fight them and stuff like that, do you think there was something about this interest that imprinted on Britain and kept this idea of the folklore going through?
Quite possibly. So some fascinating recent research has actually shown up in York, it's quite a while ago now they found it, but they found a burial with a human skeleton in which had bite marks.
Oh.
Now, we know from historical accounts, at least on the continent, especially in Rome itself, that during a day at the amphitheatre where gladiators were fighting and people would be executed, they also had the beast fights. So they had these creatures that they would have probably imported from all parts of the empire, and often it was enslaved people who were fighting them. It wasn't the gladiators we think of, like trained kind of fighters. These were people who were sentenced to death, essentially, or kind of they were enslaved people who were just being sent out for entertainment purposes, because they had no rights, they had no anything. Now, we assume, and we have assumed for a long while, that those beast fights would have transferred to other parts of the empire when the Romans spread, making their way to Britain. Of course, they would have done that here as well. Interestingly, in Colchester, we don't have an amphitheatre, at least it hasn't been found yet. But we know there are other amphitheatres in the country, and we know gladiators were here in Colchester because of some objects we found. That's a conversation for another time, but we have evidence for gladiators being here. But this evidence from York is interesting because it shows a bite mark, and as of only this year has been published that we know for a fact that it was a lion.
Oh, okay.
So there was a lot of debate about, was it a bear, was it a lion, was it a tiger, was it anything, what could it be? Bears perhaps you could argue away as something more native, because although that far south they didn't have any, in Scotland at the time, in Caledonia as it was called, they had bears. So someone could have quite easily died naturally from a bear bite, or but the fact is the lion,
we don't have many lions walking around.
Well, no, exactly. But what's more exciting is that actually this is the first evidence of people fighting lions in the Roman period, full stop.
Right.
We don't even have these bite marks on burials from Rome or from other places. So the first example we have of people fighting these beasts is in Britain, which is really interesting. And so, of course, I think, and a bit like with the crocodile, this idea that you're living in Britain and you've maybe always lived in Britain, then suddenly you go to a day at the games and you see these creatures. Yeah. You're going to think, what are they? Where have they come from? Undoubtedly, there would have been some sort of explanation at the beginning. There could have been like this announcement saying, today we're going to have the lions from North Africa and the bears from Caledonia and the boars from Greece and all these kind of creatures that they might have brought together. But that still wouldn't necessarily explain to you what it is, where it's come from, what how it was kind of brought here. And when you've already got that concept of the mythology of kind of minotaurs, centaurs, like all those other creatures that exist in Roman mythology in your kind of belief system, you're going to possibly equate it with something like that. You're going to think this is some fantastical beast that's been captured from this other land and brought to my country. And that, in a sense, will then reinforce those stories for many, many years afterwards. Yeah, because I guess people would be going home and talking about it and saying, we saw this giant thing, this giant thing with all this fur and these claws. And, So, what have we got here? Okay. So are there any records or whispers of now extinct creatures being native to Essex, such as animals that may have sparked stories that evolved over time into cryptids or mythical beasts? So we have sort of touched upon this. There's not Huge amount. So Essex, going back far enough, we sadly didn't have any dinosaurs.
Right.
The part of the country we're in was mostly underwater in that period. We do have things like megalodon though.
Okay.
So the big sharks.
Yeah.
And you do find those teeth.
Yeah.
Especially kind of around Wharton and Clacton and kind of along that coast.
Plenty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
and again, if you encountered something like that and
Yeah.
you're walking along the beach and you see one of those sticking out the rocks, I am certain it would again inspire some of the legends. Like I said, dragon legends have existed, especially in Essex, for a long time. There's loads of them. Almost any village you go to, there'll be some sort of local dragon story.
Yeah.
And likely those things come from those fossils that were found that are kind of at that time unexplained.
Right.
Similarly with the big bones, like I said, mammoths have been found in this part of the country quite a lot. And other things like woolly rhino. So woolly rhino we had here for quite a while in the last ice age, and so if you find a giant horn on the beach or wherever,
Yeah.
again, you're not going to think, well, there's no creatures alive now that has anything like that. What could that have been?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think a lot of the species that lived here historically certainly would have added to some of those myths. But we also know that there were definitely kind of imported, shall we say, kind of things, that whether that's the stories that were imported or whether things were imported. So one of the things we feature in the Mythical Creatures exhibition is narwhal tusks.
Right. Okay.
So narwhal are not native to Britain. They're found in the seas much further kind of to north and west around the Arctic, and they were traded with the assumption that they were unicorn horns.
Oh, okay.
Because they look a bit like what you'd think a unicorn horn would look like. But of course, they're not native and they're not unicorn horns. But there was this trade that developed, especially as from a European perspective, more of the world was discovered.
Yeah.
And people were traveling to other parts and finding out about different cultures, different beliefs, different animals. Those were being brought back, and a bit like in Roman times, there was a bit of mistranslation probably as those stories were arriving in Britain. And so these, rather than, I mean, sure, there would be some examples of new stories being created, but it almost reinforced those older stories. The ideas of the unicorn, the dragon, all those things, all of this new evidence that was being brought to Britain, even though it was sort of not quite correct information, was just reinforcing those stories.
Yeah. And although we're sort of saying there may be not many things that have turned into the idea of cryptids locally here, is there anything maybe slightly further afield, but like that, do we have like English cryptids?
Yeah, I'd say so. We have a sort of Bigfoot as well, actually. In Cambridgeshire, I think in Essex, there was a case of kind of big, hairy, kind of strange creatures wandering forest. Not that we have many forests left sadly in this country. But yeah, you do kind of have those. Black Shuck is probably another example where you still get sightings to this day. I don't think there's been any kind of proper ones for a couple of years, but in terms of recent modern history, you still get people who say, I think I saw this giant creature wandering the kind of the countryside.
So I think I've seen one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Whereabouts?
With no.
Okay.
While on a train.
Okay.
Maybe 12 years ago.
Yeah.
When they were talking about the big panther that had escaped.
So that is the other thing. There seems to have been this shift in recent history away from Black Shuck and towards alien big cats, the ABCs. So, and we know that big cats have escaped captivity in the past, and in the recent past as well. So, and although there are more strict laws nowadays on the keeping of exotic animals, we also know for a fact that people are keeping exotic pets when they shouldn't be keeping exotic pets. If they become too big and they can't look after them, what you're going to do? Take them out to the middle of the countryside, let them go.
Yeah.
So whether it's a Black Shuck, whether Black Shuck is real, or whether Black Shuck has always been sightings of misidentified giant creatures that are real. And that's what I find fascinating about cryptids, actually. There's the cryptid kind of concept toes the line of the supernatural and the real.
Yeah.
It's this idea that at one point we thought this was supernatural, and at this point we think actually it could be a real thing. So much of science and the natural world and our discovery, at one point these things weren't real, and suddenly we find them, and gorillas is a good example. Gorillas were seen as mythical creatures almost up until the point the first kind of at least European people found them and said, oh no, actually this is a real creature. This isn't a spirit. This isn't a kind of weird entity that lives in the jungle. It's an actual animal that we can classify and that we can capture, sadly, and we can kind of do what we would do with any other animal. So yeah, even up until more recent history, this kind of like, is it a paranormal supernatural being, or is it just something we don't know? That's kind of something that I find really fascinating.
Yeah, but just so for the audience who may be in America or other countries and not familiar with black shuck, because it's quite a local thing. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So black shuck is a giant spectral dog, usually black, that has bright red eyes in some accounts. Is sort of connected to hellhounds, so the idea of these dogs coming from the underworld. And there are stories in especially Suffolk. Suffolk is the area that has a lot of these stories of these dogs initially being kind of cited as omens of doom or destruction. And there are a few churches that supposedly have evidence of black shuck having been there. So Bungay and Blythburgh are kind of two main areas where there were big sightings in the medieval period. And I can't remember which, but one of the churches has these kind of scorch marks on the door, which, according to legend, is where the dog kind of came and kind of scratched at the door and left these scorch marks. Now, I think more recent research has proven that they're not, that they were from something else entirely. Probably someone dropped a candle or something, I don't know. But like, there's evidence to suggest that it wasn't. There was a more kind of another explanation for what caused these scorch marks. But the story has persisted, and that's kind of the idea, is that I think people are more likely to believe, because it's more entertaining, as a story of a demon dog rather than an accident that happened and caused a strange feature in a building.
Honestly, I didn't burn it down. It was the demon dog.
Exactly. It could be something like that. But yeah, so black shuck has this big reputation in the east of England as this kind of...
What do you think is persisted? What do you think fascinates people with this idea of some sort of hellhound over, maybe some escaped giant, brought over mythical, or sort of creature or lion or something like that?
I'm not really sure. So black shuck sort of starts in the 1100s, and was actually connected to the legend of the Wild Hunt. So it started with actually a bigger myth of a group of ghost spirits kind of wandering the countryside. So people on horseback who were hunting with their dogs, and then eventually it morphed into just the dog. The dog was the thing that was wandering the countryside. And the Wild Hunt is actually a national thing. So the Wild Hunt you get stories of all over, at least England. But black shuck is still this very regional thing. So it's almost like an adaptation that's, as time has gone on, as the story is adapted, it's gone reduced to just this one creature. And then maybe it's because seeing a strange creature in the wilderness is more believable than seeing an entire army of ghosts on horseback. And so that's where I think sometimes these stories, you pick on these elements that are more believable and more relevant to your local area, and that's where it kind of it becomes the legend that it eventually is to this day.
Lovely. Thinking about other sort of cryptids or mythical creatures that could have been explained, what's your view on a Loch Ness monster?
I mean, again, Loch Ness is a very deep, very large body of water that could hide absolutely anything, potentially, that connects to the sea. So anything that goes in could quite easily go out. I don't think it's a dinosaur. I think if a dinosaur had survived, you would need more than one creature for it to survive for millions of years. And even then, as we know through evolution, even creatures that have kind of survived those millions, crocodiles, for example, always goes back to crocodiles. Crocodiles we know were around at the same time as dinosaurs. However, they were not the crocodiles we have today. They were still slightly different to the crocodiles we have now. So visually you would have seen them and thought, it looks like a crocodile, but it's not quite a crocodile. So whatever this creature is would be different to the dinosaurs that existed millions of years ago anyway, because of evolution and adaptation and things like that. It could be a creature in there. There's been suggestions of eels, otters, an elephant, all of these kind of things.
Elephant.
Yeah, there was a suggestion. So the famous, is it the surgeon's photograph, the famous photograph, black and white one, is kind of that classic kind of thing, sticking out of the water.
Like
Someone did some research and found apparently there was a circus that was near Loch Ness around the same time, and they had elephants, and perhaps they let the elephants swim in the lake, and that is what they observed. I don't know how true that is. It is an interesting, plausible answer. The fact that a lot of studies have been done and shown that the photograph is genuine, it hasn't been like adapted or changed or anything. But it's an interesting one because, well, there's a lot of this circumstantial, kind of potentially coincidental evidence for it being that, but we don't know. No one has definitively said, oh yeah, that's definitely my elephant that I had when I was at a circus nearby. And now, obviously, the issue we get as well with these accounts is the further in time you go away from them, the harder it will be to prove, because those people either aren't around to question, or the evidence just gets less. The concept, the story of it becomes bigger than the actual reality of it, and so you can't really question anyone because they're so kind of ingrained in the myth and the legend. It's why, like, it's the same we have with like trials at law courts. Like, you need independent witnesses that haven't. So any case that's been in the media, it's really difficult to find a jury to kind of go on that case, because they'll be swayed by what's been written in the papers, what they've heard from their friends, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, the further we get away from these sightings. So it's the recent sightings that I find are interesting as well, because they are often quite different. And as with all cryptids, it's funny that you will often get the classic, even in today's age where cameras on your phones are so good, you get the blurry image, the moving juddery camera, and all of that. And there is this boom. I love looking at kind of YouTube videos and stuff of all these kind of real sightings. They're all the same. They're all kind of, it's so hard to prove. And obviously with technology increasing and CGI and AI and all that kind of stuff, it's getting harder and harder for those who are interested in finding out the truth and what is the reality of these creatures. It's getting harder for us to do that with technology, sadly.
Yeah, that's a shame. But interesting to maybe now think that Loch Ness was actually just an elephant having a bath.
Could be, yeah.
Let's go back to the medieval period. Great worms.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about great worms?
So it goes back to that kind of story of dragons, and in fact the village of Wormingford, where the supposed kind of possible crocodile kind of dragon sighting that happened, the village of Wormingford is named after the worm. So worms were just an alternative name for dragon.
Okay, right.
So it doesn't relate to the worms in the ground. Possibly tangentially, i.e. these long slippery creatures that kind of exist. It comes from kind of the early medieval period, so Anglo-Saxon Viking mythology more than anything. And again, those kinds of dragons, even the dragon as an entity changes throughout time. So the concept of what a dragon has changed throughout time and across the world. So dragons are fascinating because they almost exist everywhere. There is something that anyone in the world could look at and say that's a dragon, but it would still be slightly different to their local dragon. So for example, the kind of European dragons, usually on 4 legs with wings, fire breathing, etc. Whereas if you go to kind of Eastern Asia, those dragons are much more long and slender, sometimes have legs, sometimes don't. They're more associated with water. It's kind of a slightly different variation on the same concept. And then of course you have wyverns, which are only wings and two legs. And some people argue aren't dragons, but they're the kind of die-hard dragon fans, I guess. Like I'm not bothered either way. They look enough like dragons to me. But they are these kind of lizard-like creatures that kind of exist in mythology, that did actually adapt in medieval period to become these kind of more symbols of good versus evil. So where you get these images of the knight slaying the dragon, it's kind of metaphorical. It's this idea of the good defeating the evil. That's kind of how it works, which is why the knight is always huge and kind of above, and the dragon is smaller and below. So there's a lot of symbolism around these things, but as we've said, there's also a lot of kind of reality in the sense that people believe they've observed these creatures. And worms is kind of where you get these kind of sightings throughout history, especially in England, of these creatures that are dragon-like, that were seen in the landscape. Sometimes they were battling each other. So there's kind of accounts of these kind of, it's funny, it's like an Essex Suffolk kind of fight between these dragons in one of these myths. And I can't remember who won. I think Essex won, probably, if it came from Essex. Probably one of those things where either side says the other one wins.
Yeah.
But then you also get them. You have a lot of mythology where it's folklore, where it's kind of they're tricksters. So that is quite an English thing, actually, with dragon mythology, is that they're tricksters. So there's one story from near Chelmsford, actually, where there was a dragon. They were basically building a new church, and every day they would make progress building the church. And at night, the dragon would come and move all the building material down the hill.
Yeah.
And so they just kept going on and on for longer and longer, and they couldn't quite finish the church until eventually, I think they made like an offering to the dragon and said, "Can you please leave us alone? Here's some food or here's something." And then the dragon left them alone eventually. Or gold, probably. That's always the thing with dragons, is gold. Kind of in a lot of folk tales from across the world, there's kind of fascination with dragons and gold.
Where do you think that comes from? Is it something to do with, the evil? Is it the idea of greed and
I think part of that is that kind of covetous nature of kind of hoarding as well, and not sharing your wealth. The other thing is some of the early dragon legends actually are kind of possibly related to natural phenomena, and they're related to things in the ground. So a lot of dragons are believed to have lived in either caves or kind of deep under the ground. That's kind of the mythology around them in most places. But we think actually that sometimes this was in places with, say, volcanic activity, where you'd hear rumblings in the ground, things like that. You don't know what it is. The Romans described it as Vulcan, the god, forging and making things. But in other cultures, they might have thought it was a creature living in there, and that's where the dragon comes from. You also get it in a lot of, and again linked to volcanoes, in kind of like poisonous, gassy kind of places with methane deposits or kind of things like that, which actually in early Greek mythology, the thing that's kind of closest to a dragon had poison breath. Rather than fire breath, it was believed to have poison breath. And we think that was where you have these marshes or bogs or things with poisonous air, that they didn't understand what was causing it. So they created this legend that there was a dragon living in that area that creates this poison breath, and that kind of...
That's kind of a warning, I guess, that don't go to there because the dragon will get you.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a lot of mythology and folklore is a warning to people not to... I mean, mermaids are similar. Don't go swimming in the sea without... Especially, like, in the past, where people didn't really swim that much. Swimming wasn't really a thing, and boats were kind of pretty basic. But the idea of these creatures living in the ocean was a deterrent, so you didn't go swimming and get swept out to sea.
Right.
It's a similar sort of thing, and dragons is to kind of warn you from going to places where you might be in danger.
Yeah.
And if someone were to say to you, "Oh, don't go over there, it's a bit smelly and you might die," you're less likely to follow it than there's a creature out there and it will hunt you down.
Yeah.
You're more likely to say, "Oh, actually, I'll stay at home. I'm not going to go out into that area."
Yeah.
So I think these kind of stories are embellishments of the truth, in order to tell these stories of morality and safety, and to kind of keep humanity living, really.
Great, yeah. Let's move on and talk about shapeshifters.
Yes.
So, shapeshifters is stuff that we find in the paranormal a lot. Mm-hmm. But how does that translate into sort of mythical and folklore, and what's your experience with that sort of stuff?
So you get stories of shapeshifting for centuries, thousands of years. The Romans had a few different stories. So Ovid was a Roman writer, wrote a lot of poetry, and he wrote an entire book called Metamorphoses, which was all about changing and shapeshifting. And one of the stories in there, which relates to kind of more modern phenomena, more modern kind of more in horror movies than folklore, but obviously still some people believe these creatures are real and out there, is werewolves. So for the Romans, they were called versipelles, which literally means turn skin.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily relate to a wolf at that time.
Yeah.
But these are creatures who could change their skin, essentially, which literally would be turning into a different creature. Mm-hmm. But there is a story, an account, and I think it was Ovid who kind of told the story, of a person who was traveling and encounters a soldier on his journey, and the soldier was on their own. And start having a conversation. It's late at night, and they kind of say, "Oh, late at night, dangerous on the road. Be careful." And I think they met at some point, and then they end up traveling on the road. Actually, I think that was it. They met at a party, and then they end up traveling on the road separately. But then he encounters the soldier later on. Yeah. The soldier is standing in a field in the moonlight, completely naked, and decides to pee in a circle around himself. and then before this character's eyes turns into a wolf.
Wow.
And runs off. And so this is kind of
and this is a wolf rather than like a werewolf.
That is a specific, so a wolf. So not a human-shaped wolf. It is just a wolf.
Yeah.
At least that's how it's described.
Okay.
And then runs off, and he I don't think he sees the wolf again. But it's kind of he then goes on to the next town and tells the story, and that's kind of how supposedly the story got passed down through the generations. But you have plenty of stories, and a lot of them of shape-shifting relate to the gods. So it's usually if you have, I guess, in our modern understanding is this idea of sin.
Yeah.
So if you've sinned or if you've done something bad, the gods will punish you. And one of the ways they did that was through shapeshifting. So they turn you into an animal, or they turn you into a tree, or they turn you into something, so you're no longer human. And in fact, some of those stories are still ways in which the ancient Greeks or the Romans or whoever would interpret the natural world still. So you'd see trees with kind of faces in them,
and so they've been transformed by a god or something for doing something bad.
So it's kind of that kind of interpretative thing of like understanding the natural world through story, which was very common throughout history. Is kind of as we've said, is there's a lot of different times and places where people have done that to try and understand what was going on in the natural world when they just didn't have that awareness of science and medicine or anything like that.
So in many ways, this sort of modern idea of like paranormal idea of the skinwalkers, you know, is actually something that we can trace. Is not a sudden internet phenomena. It's something we can trace back from stories thousands and thousands of years ago. So we had Ovid talking about skinwalkers back then.
And I think again, like with dragons and like with a lot of these, in every culture you'll find something similar. You'll find that story of these kind of, and I think this is the thing. I remember reading this book once. I think it was called On Monsters, and it was all about kind of the history of a bit looking at like fossils and interpretation of that and etc. And the last chapter was about humans, because we are the most terrifying creature that exists out there. And this human fear of other humans actually is a big kind of force in storytelling and folklore, because if you look at some of the biggest ones, like the mermaids, like centaurs, like all of these creatures, the ones that kind of have this longevity, even the minotaur, they're all part human. There's an element of them that is human, and that is the thing, is that, and like with skinwalkers, because of the kind of the Native American kind of mythology around the idea of cannibalism, and that's how kind of these entities were created. It's all down to the idea of what are the worst elements of humanity. What is we all know exists in us, but we hate the fact that it exists in us. And how do we warn others not to go down that path? How do we warn others not to kind of follow the mistakes of people who've come before us? And a lot of the time, folklore and mythology is the way that we kind of ensure that happens.
So as a sensible, clever man, what do you think there's any truth in creatures or humanoids that can transform?
I have not seen any evidence for it, so at this current point in time I would say no. However, my attitude has always been, it's a bit like my thoughts around ghosts. Okay, ghosts are real in the sense that weird stuff happens, people observe it, people hear it, but we just don't know what ghosts are. Skinwalkers might be real. We don't know what skinwalkers are, but they are things that people have observed, they have heard, they kind of believe exist in the world. And that's why I think it's really fascinating to kind of inquire into it and look into it and say, well, what could it be? Whether it is a real life animal that we've just not encountered yet, whether it's an entirely fictional story, we don't know. But there's something to it. There will be something to it, because otherwise these stories wouldn't have been created in the first place.
As an archaeologist, what sort of hard evidence would you be looking for to prove that they existed?
I don't think archaeology could ever prove it, because if someone can change form when they die, they are likely to only be in one form.
Right.
I would have thought. Again, this isn't something I would know biologically how that would work anyway. But you would imagine that if someone is changing their shape, when they die, they own one shape, and that is what you would find archaeologically. It would only be through kind of modern observation. I'm the sort of person that I need to see something to be able to believe it.
Yeah.
And which is why I was kind of saying, sadly, with modern technology, that's becoming even harder.
Yeah.
Because films are kind of creating especially all YouTube videos, they're all, a lot of them are fake.
Yeah,
They're
they're creating
obviously fake.
false narratives.
Yeah.
And it's becoming harder to tell whether it's real or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is affecting people's belief, I think whether it's to the extremes though.
Yeah.
So either people are seeing this stuff and thinking, oh, it must be real, it's definitely real, I definitely believe in ghosts, demons, skinwalkers, whatever. Or they're going to the extreme and saying, well, all of this is clearly fake, they must not be real.
Yeah.
So now we don't really have that middle ground. I try and keep myself in that middle ground as an open-minded skeptic, but I feel like there are more people polarizing because of it, because you can't really stay in that middle ground anymore.
So tell us more about some of the stuff that you're going to feature as part of the exhibition.
Yeah, so Mythical Creatures, the exhibition opening 26th of July 2025, will have mainly 4 kind of key areas of focus. So there will be unicorns, griffins, mermaids and dragons. We are kind of looking at it from the medieval perspective in the idea of the bestiaries. So they were writing these books, a bit like Pliny the Elder, to be fair, in the Roman times, but even in medieval times, they were writing these books on the natural world, including things like dragons and mermaids and things, as if they were real.
Yeah.
And they believed that they were kind of parts of the natural world. And so we're kind of looking at it from that perspective, and we're trying to ask the question, why did they think they were real? What was the evidence out there to kind of that led them to create these stories and these creatures? So we look at some of the natural world specimens that inspired these stories. We look at some objects that have them depicted on, just so you can see how the image of those creatures has changed throughout time. One thing a lot of people may not know is that actually in the medieval period, unicorns were a bit more goat-like.
Oh, right.
They looked more like goats than horses. They had like these long goatee beards. They had cloven hooves.
Yeah.
So, and then that changed as time went on to make them more horse-like.
Yeah.
So, you know, all these things have kind of, they're never static. Those stories are never kind of one story that stays the same forever. So we're looking at the kind of history, and then we end looking at local legends. We end looking at some of the stories nearby. So we look at Black Shuck. We look at the Ipswich Ogre. So there's a story of an ogre in Ipswich.
Let's hear about that.
So the Ipswich Ogre, so you can go and see the Ipswich Ogre to this day.
Okay.
There is a grotesque face above a building in Ipswich, which, according to legend, was because there was an ogre living on the site originally.
Yep.
And as the town grew bigger and needed to expand, they were encroaching on this land, and of course the ogre didn't want this to happen, and so they kind of, I believe they kind of started to kind of kidnap some of the townspeople and take them away, and people noticed or something's happening.
Yeah.
They realized it was the ogre doing this, and they eventually came to an agreement. I don't know how you would, it's not quite like Shrek, but it's kind of, they came to an agreement where, as long as the ogre said, as long as there was always an image of him in the town, they would be allowed to move into his land.
Right.
And so they created this sculpture sort of this face that now sits above a doorway in Ipswich and has been there for a very long time, and is believed to be reference to this legend of the ogre.
And so what exactly was an ogre for them?
So for them was a kind of a humanoid creature, looked very human, but larger, stronger, smellier, kind of this big kind of
So
being.
kind of how we see it.
How we would see it today, to be fair. And what's interesting, I think, is, and there's a more recent account of not an ogre, but in Essex actually. I can't remember exactly where it was, but there was this account of this creature supposedly living in a forest. And it turns out it was just a man who was living out there in the wild and had kind of decided to give up on society and was kind of living in the forest. And of course, if you see this kind of half-naked hairy man wandering around, possibly from a distance will look bigger than you'd have thought, you might think, oh, there's a Bigfoot, there's an ogre, there's a whatever.
Yeah.
And perhaps some of those ogre, troll, all those stories are actually people who were shunned from society, living in the wilderness, and these stories then came from that.
Well,
So so that's one of the other stories. We've got a whole host of dragons, and we've got a few other kind of bits and pieces for that as well. But what's quite exciting about this exhibition, which is something we haven't done before, particularly for our younger audiences, is there will also be this story narrative kind of throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
So the idea, if you want to, you don't have to. The idea is if you want to follow the story, you're on an adventure, essentially. The fishing crew in your local village have been kidnapped by a mermaid, and you have to go through and find the objects that the mermaid has asked you to find belonging to the dragon, to the unicorn and the griffin. And at each point on the way, you kind of have to prove yourself as being loyal and brave and honest and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Solving a riddle with the dragon, all those kinds of things. And then eventually you kind of get back and find your crew and rescue them. So we've commissioned some illustrations by a local artist as well, who has created these beautiful images, which will be in the exhibition as well, that you can see.
Amazing. So we've got a kind of a mini escape roomy sort of.
Yeah, so we wanted it to be interactive. So a lot of the time exhibitions, we try and always make them quite interactive here in Colchester, but I know that a lot of exhibitions you go to are just, you go read the labels, look at the objects, isn't that lovely? Move on. But I think museums are more and more trying to make them more interactive, especially for younger people. But like I say, you don't have to be a child to enjoy the story. You can do it yourself as an adult if you want to. It's just a different way of engaging with the subject. Yeah. And that's what we wanted to do with this one. So especially as the whole thing is around storytelling, it seemed a bit pointless to have an exhibition about storytelling and not have a story. Yeah. So hopefully it'll be something different that people enjoy.
Great. Thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure that you come down to the Colchester Castle and see this brand new exhibition, and obviously if you're watching it here in the castle, thank you very much for taking the time to watch it, and remember to like, subscribe, comment, and we'll see you next time.